Paso a presentar a la siguiente ponencia, la recepción del primer concilio de Nicea. Nos hablará la profesora Sara Parvis de la Universidad de Edimburgo. Ella nació también en Escocia, se formó en Oxford y, pues, como muchos sabrán, tiene una producción bibliográfica muy abundante. Yo destacaría, y más en el contexto también, no solamente del Congreso, sino también de la relación que nos va a dirigir, su obra principal, que es Marcelo de Ansira y los últimos años de la controversia arriana, 325-345. Aparte de esta publicación, que es la que yo destacaría más, aparte porque es un autor fundamental y una presentación muy clara que hace de él, tiene otras publicaciones que pueden encontrar también en el currículum que se refieren sobre todo a este periodo y a la actividad, digamos, teológica conciliar. Ahí es la palabra. Muchas gracias.
Can you all hear me all right? Not very well. So these are much more high-tech than the ones we have at Edinburgh. We tend to just have radio mics. So thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this Congreso. I'm going to speak in English, but as you know, I have a handout which summarizes the main argument, and I hope you'll have some good suggestions so that when the written version of this comes out, it will be stronger, because I'm just getting to know Osius, really, and I know him completely differently from being here, and I hope that after talking to you, I'll have a bit more idea again. So I've already published work on the general topic of the reception of Nicaea, and some of you may have read this, but I will summarize this first so that the overall argument is clearer, because the argument I'm going to make today that's on your handout is really, if you like, encased in that framework. It's specifically focused on Osius and what happens if you look at reception through the eyes of Osius. But I think you'll only make sense of that if you know what my wider framework for making sense of the period from 325 to 381 is. So the chapter which I'm going to start by summarizing is called The Reception of Nicaea and Homoousios to 360 in the Cambridge Companion to the Council of Nicaea, which appeared in 2021. And it can be summarized in the following points. So, and this is the key thing. If you only take one thing away from this lecture, this is what I want you to take away, unless you already knew it. The main acts of the Council of Nicaea began to be reversed already after 2 years in 325 by Constantine. So there's a very long period in which there is no Nicaea to speak of properly. And that's one reason why it's so important that in 381 we give the original creed of Nicaea time to come back. And I'll say a little bit about that in consequence of the previous lecture, because I have a slightly different way of making sense of what happened with the creed that I do think was drawn up in 381. But I think, as a spoiler alert, as we say, I do think it was the original Nicene Creed that was re-legalized in 381. And I think that was necessary because it had had such a long time when it was either forgotten, well, either pushed to one side or illegal. So in 327, Constantine recalled Arius from exile. He also arranged for Eustathius of Antioch to be deposed and sent him into exile. Athanasius was sent into exile in 335, and Marcellus of Ancyra was sent into exile in 336. So that's most of Nicaea reversed by then. Alternative creeds with alternative anathemas began to be proposed from 328 onwards. The two most important, I think, which were both championed by Constantine's son, Constantius II, were the Dedication Creed of 341 and the Creed of Constantinople of 360. The binding legal status of the Creed of 360 meant that any use of any term containing ousia to describe the relationship of the son to the father, including homoousios and homoiousios, was banned, was illegal. And it was not officially reversed until 381. So you have a period under Julian, as I'll mention, and Jovian, when nobody cares. But other than those couple of years, from 360, it's banned until 381. Finally, and those of you who've read my chapter obviously will know this, but this is my very strong, if you like, argument. If it had not been for Athanasius, and especially his writings on the decrees of Nicaea in 353 and on the synods of Ariminum and Seleucia in 359, the Creed of Nicaea would have sunk without trace long before 381. It would just have disappeared without Athanasius's perseverance. The Creed was subjected to a long, concerted attempt to get rid of it, really from very near the beginning, and without him, that would probably have succeeded. So Athanasius contra mundum is true, if you like. So I'll add to this summary of that article, which is the sort of frame for the osseous argument I'll make here. A summary of, I've written a book on the Council of Constantinople of 381, which I hope will appear early next year. And I just want to take a couple of framing things from it as well, which are also relevant, just to not have to explain them in this paper. After Constantius's death in 361, his successor, Julian, the apostate, privatized Christianity. Now, I'll explain what I mean by that, but it completely changed everything and certainly changed theological discussion. 5 parties emerged during Julius's reign: the Eunomians, the Eudoxians, the Macedonianists, the Old Nicenes, and the New Nicenes. We know these under theological names. We know them especially from the canons of Constantinople 381. The Eunomians and the Eudoxians accepted the creed, and they were organized around the 3 creeds. And I think this isn't always seen. These 3 creeds were the standout creeds of the 4th century. The Eunomians and the Eudoxians accepted the creed of 360. It's not that they necessarily liked it that much, especially the Eunomians, but it was a creed that allowed them to have the theology they wanted. The Macedonianists sometimes accepted the Nicene Creed, but they preferred the Dedication Creed, endorsed by the majority party at the Council of Seleucia in 359. So that in the East had a period of being a very strongly supported creed, although it was never of any interest, particularly in the West, with anybody except Hilary of Poitiers. The Old and New Nicenes both espoused the Nicene Creed, but were in disagreement over who should be Bishop of Antioch, Paulinus or Meletius. So, okay, this is well known. The original, and I've just, to repeat the last point again that I made at the beginning, the original Nicene Creed was legally reinstated, in my view, by the Council of Constantinople in 381. So a word about the Emperor Julian, then, before I turn to Osseous, just to explain what I mean by privatization. And in a sense, this is my happy ending. And I have to give you my happy ending before the talk, because the talk doesn't have a happy ending, it has a sad ending. But if you like, there's a happy ending after the sad ending, but it was after Osseous died. So, well, we hope he has his happy ending now, but in eternity. But to explain about the Emperor Julian, When Constantius II died in 361, he was replaced by the Emperor Julian as sole ruler. Julian reversed the state's preferential treatment of Christianity and made it a private religion. An important aspect of Julian's privatization of Christianity was to pronounce that the state would not adjudicate between candidates for the episcopacy. Christians had to solve their disputes over local church ownership for themselves as local matters. And this isn't always taken on board, the extent to which church-state relations, even from the middle of the 3rd century, are about property. That's what the Donatists are about, really, and that's really what starts Nicaea too. It's about who should have this magnificent basilica, who should have these magnificent churches. So as far as Julian was concerned, you can sort it out yourselves. So Christians had to become local again instead of thinking at court level, at the top level in the 360s. They had to reconnect with their people. They had to become pastoral again. And, prescinding from the fact that he did actually attack people and prevent people being educated, it actually did Christianity a world of good, in my opinion. It did theology a world of good because people were able to actually talk about what mattered. Julian's sole reign lasted less than 2 years, as I said. In that time, the 5 parties developed. But over the next 15 years, the alliances between the various parties shifted, but the new Nicenes won out, as we all know, after the death of Valens in 376. The Creed of Nicaea was legally reinstated in 381. And just to note, in case you're wondering what I think happened to the Creed of 381 that I do think was drawn up in 381, I think we have to see it as publicly promulgated as part of Chalcedon. Well, we had that conversation a minute ago. So I think it took 126 years to get the Creed of Nicaea. That's synodality for me. It's historical synodality, where we start with homoousios, and then we keep going. And by 451, we have the creed that we now say every week. So that's my overall sketch. But today we're here in Cordova, and I want to look again at the reception of the Council of Nicea, specifically through the career of Bishop Osius of Cordova, because it allows us, I think, to highlight specific features of how the Council of Nicea was regarded in later years. And here, if you're wondering, I finally do get to the handout. As you may know, if you've read my work or listened to me, I like to think about the human side of all of this. And often when I connected with Osius, it really made me think about the human side, which Athanasius, of course, is very good at making you think about. So I will be looking at 4 moments from Osius's career. His involvement just before and at Nicaea itself. We've already heard about this, and obviously there are different possible, as we all know, different ways of adding up the different moments in the period just before Nicaea and what happened at Nicaea. So I'll give you my suggestions. The significance of Osius's return to the West and Constantine's change of heart when he himself returned to the eastern half of the empire. And I think that's quite a stark moment, and it's interesting to see that as a turning point. And although we can't really answer some of the questions about what caused what and why exactly Constantine changed and why exactly Osius went, I think it's helpful to think about that moment when Nicaea stops being Nicaea is the moment at which Osius goes at a certain level. So next, Osius's role in the move from the Council of Antioch of 340 to the Council of Sardica in 343, and the whole question of thinking about what it meant for Nicaea to be an ecumenical council, because that's the moment at which it starts being called an ecumenical council, when they're starting to think about what an ecumenical council actually is. And then finally, Osius's role in Constantius's move to ban the term homoousios in 357, and with it the Nicene Creed. And I'll have a few remarks about where that fits into the overall narrative at the end. So the first phase, Nicaea and Osius's role in its politics. So Osius of Cordova, is this, are you hearing me all right? Do feel free to wave your hand or something if I'm not. I think this is being recorded, so it probably would be good if I get picked up by the mic. So, Nicaea and Osius's role in its politics. Osius of Cordova had been present at the court of Constantine from at least 313, as we were hearing earlier this week, when he was involved in the beginning of the Donatist debates, as we know because he's mentioned in a letter to Constantine to Cecilian of Carthage, given by Eusebius of Caesarea in his ecclesiastical history. Osius had come east with Constantine in 324, and was at hand when Constantine defeated Licinius at the Battle of Chrysopolis in September that year. He was closely involved in the negotiations ahead of the Council of Nicea. There are two main theories as to what happened with regard to the calling of the Council of Nicea. But this is a nice thing for today. Whichever of the theories is true, Osius is still at the center of it. So I want to just remind you, wherever you stand on this, of what the two possibilities are, and then sketch in either way what the importance of Osius is. And Osius, not only himself, but his relations with Alexander of Alexandria, Eustathius of Antioch, and Marcellus of Ancyra are crucial to Nicaea. And I think this is crucial to making sense of what we really think Nicaea was all about and what we think the sort of reception up until certainly the death of Osius was. And who drops out at different times when Athanasius doesn't. So the traditional view is that Constantine himself called the Council of Nicea, at first to meet in the city of Ancyra. But unless you think that's a fake, of course, but I haven't worried about that problem. You can bring it up if you want. So I'm assuming that the argument that the text saying that the council was moved from Ancyra to Nicea is genuine. So it's just a question of who called it to Ancyra in the first place. So we should note that the timing of this move, so first of all that the council's called to meet in the city of Ancyra, and then moved to Nicea. If you think Constantine called that council after the Battle of Chrysopolis, you have very tight timing. So obviously we have the terminus ACO is September 324. We should note that the timing, that all the things we have to fit into this period, and again, it depends if you think Osius went to Alexandria or not, but we have to include, if you want them all, Osius going to Alexandria to take the letter from Constantine to Alexander and Arius, which is referred to in Eusebius of Caesarea's Life of Constantine. You have to include on the way the fact that he presided, either the way there or the way back, that he presided over a synod in Antioch, which elected Eustathius as Bishop of Antioch. And at that synod of Antioch, it was already known that a great and hieratic synod was due to meet at Ancyra. So if this synod had been called by Constantine, or if it was called by Constantine, it must have been with Osius's advice and perhaps at his suggestion, and in a very fast and tight timetable. So Osius, we will remember, was expert in the Donatist problem. He was expert in advising Constantine on how to hold a council, even though he wasn't actually at the Council of Arles. He'd seen councils before. Obviously, he was at Elvira, and so Iliberis. So the idea is that he would instantly have been aware of what the possibilities were as soon as that battle was won. But it must be Osius who's at the center of it either way. Now, there are three important points to make about Ancyra, and this is assuming that Osius went the land route and not the sea route because it was winter, so that he would have gone from Nicomedia through the main route, which really the only possibility is Ansira, up to Antioch, and then on to Alexandria. So 3 important points about Ansira. First, it was on the main road between Nicomedia and Antioch. It was the only comfortable place to stay. If you think of the Putinger table, which has its 2-star hotels and its 4-star hotels, the 4-star hotel is in Ansira, and there are not very many places to stay either side between Nicomedia and Antioch. So almost anybody who's anybody, unless they can't stand Marcellus of Ansira, and at this point that's not yet too many people, is going to stay in Ansira. So that's the first point. Ansira is pretty unavoidable if you go that direction by the land route. And especially if you're a clergyman, because of course you're going to stay with the bishop, especially if you're a bishop yourself. So secondly, there had been, you'll remember, an important synod in Ansira 10 years before, in 314, which had issued 25 canons dealing with issues mostly arising from the recent persecution, so which had a great deal in common with Erlibaris, which of course Osius had been at. It had been attended, the Synod of 314 in Ansira, by only 12 bishops, but they were very well chosen. They covered the whole of the area of Asia Minor, except Ephesus. They were all the metropolitan bishops, apart from Ephesus, and a few others besides. So they were very representative, very well thought through as a group of who you would have. And thirdly, the bishop, Marcellus, was someone whom Osius would strongly support at the time of the Council of Sardica 19 years later. So he was somebody, it's possible that he only warmed to Marcellus later, but there's a lot of likelihood to the idea of his having had a nice evening drinking with Marcellus of Ansira, whatever you drank at that point, if you were a bishop, talking to another bishop, and talking about what needed to happen to sort out the problems in the East. So Marcellus was someone whom Osius would, as I say, would strongly support at the time of the Council of Sardica. So if Constantine called a synod to meet in Ansira to solve the problems in the East, which were already known about at the time of the Synod of Antioch in late 324 or early 325, this is likely to have been Osius' suggestion, and to have come about as a result of his staying with Marcellus on his way to Antioch, and they're talking about their shared experiences of canonical councils. It's difficult to imagine any other scenario in which Ansira could have been chosen by Constantine for a great and hieratic synod in the short time between the Battle of Chrysopolis and the Synod of Antioch. So if you think it was called by Constantine in that period, it's really got to have been a quick conversation between Marcellus and Osius, which led to Osius deciding that's what we have to do, and sending back a messenger, presumably to Constantine, who would then send out the invitation, so that it was already known about by the time he got to Antioch, which is only not that much further on. So that's my argument. If Constantine called the Council of Nicea, that at this point it really must have, if it heavily involves Osius as traditionally thought, it must also involve Marcellus of Ansira. The alternative possibility, which has been espoused by a number of scholars, including recently Harold Drake in his chapter "The Elephant in the Room," Constantine at the Council. So if as Harold Drake has recently argued in his chapter in the Cambridge Council to Nicea, the synod the other option is that a synod had already been called to Ansira by the bishops themselves of the East before Constantine defeated Licinius. Now, lots of people have suggested this over the years, including me, Timothy Barnes, and many other people. So Licinius's ban on episcopal synods would then have been, in this case, partly intended to prevent this synod at Ansira, either in order to protect his wife Constantia's relative, as he would be, Eusebius of Nicomedia, or to prevent the likelihood of unrest, or both, we would need to assume that the synod was intended to deal not with Arius so much as with the supporters of Eusebius of Nicomedia and Eusebius of Caesarea, with his supporters, Eusebius of Nicomedia and Eusebius of Caesarea. This is back to a question we were talking about earlier in the week. Why do you need the whole of the East to come together to solve a problem in Alexandria? Well, only if you think that Eusebius of Nicomedia and Eusebius of Caesarea are the people you really want, and Arius is, if you like, the focus, but you want more than him. So in that way of reading, as I say, this is Harold Drake's view, you have to assume that, you have to assume that the synod was intended not so much to deal with Arius, as with Eusebius of Nicomedia and Eusebius of Caesarea, and was intended to bring together Alexander of Alexandria, Philogonius, then Bishop of Antioch, so the year before, and Marcellus, as well as suitable other bishops within reach, so that, if you like, you've had medium-sized synods in the previous 10, 15 years, well, since the persecution. So you've had the Synod of Tyre, you've had the Synod of 315, you've had the Synod of Ancyra of 314, you've had a few other synods, you've had synods in Alexandria, synods in Antioch. You're going to put them all together into a synod that's maybe 3 times the size of any of these. You might have 30 bishops, perhaps, maybe 40, maybe even 50. But well chosen, the top bishops. So a carefully thought through idea. This would have been a powerful gathering in terms of church discipline, obviously, if you bring the bishops of Antioch and Alexandria and Sara together. And the only person they're up against is the bishop of Nicomedia and the bishop of Palestinian Caesarea. But also in this case, Osius would have been a key figure in the period after the Battle of Chrysopolis. So if the problem was that the synod had been called but banned by Licinius, Marcellus and his allies must have petitioned Constantine at the time of Licinius's defeat to allow it to happen. And this is one thing that's important to understanding imperial policy is it's always reactive and driven by petitions. And we know this from a lot of the accounts of Nicaea. Nicaea is driven by people petitioning Constantine. So this would be this scenario, that they petitioned Constantine to have this synod, which Licinius had not allowed. And the idea here would be that Constantine was a bit horrified, wrote the letter to Arius and Alexander, presumably after a briefing from Eusebius of Nicomedia that this was all unnecessary, as Harold Drake suggests. However, again, Osius was evidently persuaded on his journey to Antioch, if not before, that the Great and Hieratic Synod in Ancyra should be allowed to happen. So again, it has to be Osius who understands that this has to happen at Ancyra. The only way of getting rid of all of this is to decide, which some people do, is to decide that the letter about the move from Ancyra to Nicaea is a forgery, in which case you can forget the whole thing. But unless you want to do that, you have Osius controlling Ancyra. You have to have conversation between Osius and Marcellus of Ancyra in the background to the Council of Nicaea. In any case, it was clear that Osius was heavily involved in the ecclesiastical politics from Ancyra to Alexandria in the months before the Council of Nicaea, and that he aligned himself very clearly with Alexander's anti-Arian alliance. He was apparently on good terms with Marcellus of Ancyra, early enough in things to be supporting a council in Ancyra. He was also responsible for confirming Eustathius as Bishop of Antioch. Now, many of you will know the building blocks for that, the discovery the argument, for example, that Henry Chadwick made, but various other, that synod was presided over by Osius. So he was very heavily behind Eustathius of Antioch, also on the side of Alexander against Arius, and also on the side of Marcellus of Ancyra. So by the time Osius arrived in Antioch, a council had been called to Ancyra, but it must have been shortly after he returned to Nicomedia, or perhaps even before his return, that Constantine transferred this council to the imperial palace at Nicaea. So possibly while Osius was still away, and you have to assume this is Eusebius of Nicomedia. I think you have to assume this is Eusebius of Nicomedia. So the other questions about Osius and Nicaea we can leave open for more papers, since this is a paper about Nicaea's reception. Whether Osius presided at the council, how much responsibility he had for the Nicene Creed, what sort of influence he had on the canons, may all be left to other people. Although some of the arguments I'll make in the rest of this paper do have implications for his attitude, especially to the Nicene Creed, which he seems to have felt quite proprietorial about, if you look at what he says in Sardica. So I think I'll conclude this section just having set those aspects of Osius's role at Nicaea out by saying that he had put a lot of time and effort into resolving the crisis. He had journeyed long distances in winter and possibly presided over 2 regional synods. I'm a great believer that theology should be done by the people who put the work in, or if you like, so should church government. You don't just turn up and expect everyone else to do it. Osius had done it, had done the work, gone on the long journeys. Even if Constantine was unhappy at the idea of the proposed Synod of Ansara, and that was what led him to move it and take control of it, which must be the case, I think, Osius himself remained firmly on the side of the leaders of Alexander's party, Alexander himself, Marcellus, and Eustathius. He had been involved in Eustathius's case, in having him established as Bishop of Antioch in the first place. So this is important when we come to consider Nicaea's fate over the next 35 years. Now, how am I doing for time? We finish? Okay, right. So I'll speed up a little bit. But the next bit, I do want to get clearly. So Osius left the eastern parts of the empire soon after Nicaea, and he never returned there, as far as we know. We hear nothing more about him until after Constantine's death. So although the circumstances of Osius's departure after Nicaea are unknown, they can't be unconnected with the fact that Constantine effectively repudiated most of the acts of the Council of Nicaea little more than 2 years after its close. We don't know the causal direction, but they must be connected. So Constantine returned to Rome in the summer of 326. He was there in late July. It's likely that Osius returned west with the court at that point. Shortly before Constantine arrived in Rome, he had his eldest son, Crispus, the Caesar, executed by poison at Pola in Istria. It's unknown whether Osius left the court at this point or earlier, of his own accord, or was dismissed by Constantine, and under what circumstances. He presumably returned to Cordoba. However, what is clear enough is that when Constantine returned east, he evidently decided to reverse the key acts of Nicaea, including various policies which had been set up by Osius. Whether this was because he'd lost confidence in what Osius had done, or for some other reason, it's still very striking. 2 significant acts in particular took place about the same time. Constantine arranged for Eustathius of Antioch, whom he had previously supported, to be deposed from his see and sent him secretly into exile. Again, we don't exactly know why. There are 4 different suggestions made in the sources. But it did happen in the context of his mother Helena's tour of the Holy Land in late 326-7 at the Autumn Synod of Antioch. That same autumn, Constantine recalled Arius from exile. So those 2 key reversals of Nicaea. And the following spring, he recalled Eusebius of Nicomedia and Theognis of Nicaea from exile, into which they'd been sent after the Council of Nicaea. The same spring, in 328, Constantine also put pressure on Alexander to receive Arius back into communion. But Alexander died while the decision was still being debated. Athanasius, who replaced Alexander as bishop, was also pressured to receive Arius back into communion, but he always managed to avoid it. Now I'll skip on here because I don't want to run out of time. But by the time of Constantine's death in 337, Eustathius, Athanasius, and Marcellus were all in exile, at least partly in each case because they were not prepared to accept the rehabilitation of Arius. Arius himself, by this point, was already dead. He had died the previous summer. But that did little to end the ecclesiastical political struggles. Arius had been rehabilitated at the Council of Tyre, Jerusalem in 335, but Athanasius had been in custody at that time, and Marcellus refused to take part in communion with Arius. At this point, there is no evidence that the Nicene Creed was being either attacked or defended, although Eustathius of Antioch had defended the term homoousios from Eusebius of Caesarea's interpretation of it just after Nicaea. But the council itself, as we can see by Eusebius of Caesarea's description of it in his Life of Constantine, had become in the historiography merely a celebration of Constantine's peacemaking skills, his generosity with the bishops in inviting them to the Vicenalia banquet. And so Nicaea has turned into a really good dinner. I'm sure it was very nice at the time. The Council of Nicaea, if not exactly dead by 12 years later, was in the process of being slowly suffocated. So the third phase, as we said, I'm only getting to 357 today because this is Osseous, but you know the happy ending. So the Council of Antioch of 341 and the Council of Sardica of 343, and I'll just cut very quickly through this. So the summer of 337, following Constantine's death, was marked by quite a lot of chaos, politically speaking, a lot of blood. One of the four Caesars, Dalmatius, was murdered, along with most of his closest male relatives. After his death, Constantine's three surviving sons divided the empire between them. That same summer, Athanasius and Marcellus returned from exile to the sees of Alexandria and Antioch, but Eustathius apparently did not return. He may have been dead. Now, I think I'll just summarize my argument here. In terms of the creeds and the future debate of Nicaea, the Creed of Antioch 341 is the important thing, the Dedication Creed. Now, the Dedication Creed was quite likely drawn up before Nicaea. It's attributed to not Anthimus of Nicomedia, but his successor, the predecessor of Eusebius of Caesar, the martyr, the predecessor of Eusebius of Nicomedia. And so that creed, the Dedication Creed, can claim to be older than Nicaea, potentially, or at least it was claimed to be older than Nicaea. It has a number of very interesting features, and it does use non-scriptural language as well as scriptural language, but it's Homoiousian. The Homoiousians were the people who espoused it, and if you like that sort of thing, that's what you like. But what happened at Sardica then was not a creed that lasted. And this is where it's interesting to look at Osseous, because Osseous wasn't involved at all in 341. That was entirely an Eastern affair. But Sardica is an attempt to put a new Nicaea together where the substance is different, but the form is the same. So you try and get people from both East and West. It's called by an emperor with the imperial machinery, well, two emperors here, with the imperial machinery involved, and you produce a creed, is the idea. You produce an encyclical letter, you produce canons, you do all the things that Nicaea did, but in a sense it replaces Nicaea. That's the idea. Instead of defending Nicaea, it's instead of Nicaea. And that's even true for Osseous and Marcellus. And this is where they were living in the past, while Athanasius was living in the future, and probably Julius of Rome. So Athanasius and Julius of Rome understood this was not a good idea, and they sort of stand sideways. But Marcellus and Osius, it's their passionate time to say what should have happened at Nicaea. If we'd only said all this at Nicaea, what happened in the last 18 years would not have happened. And so they have a long, passionate, additional account to the creed, and which is hypostatic. And they also have the canons that they should have passed at Nicaea, which say that you go to the Bishop of Rome and that solves everything. They have, this is what should have happened council. But the trouble is, so it doesn't happen. So the council doesn't happen at all. So instead you have two sides with their own perfect fantasy version of what should have happened. And the East are even worse because, firstly, it's their worst theology, and in the sense of it has no content at all. And also, it's the encyclical letter is just ridiculous. I've proved it was written by Acacius of Caesarea, because there's no one else who fits the profile of the person who wrote it except for Acacius of Caesarea. And it's just rude. It's not constructive in any possible way. So it's a really interesting council, which is trying to do all the things structurally that are true of an ecumenical council, but talking completely past each other and with no intention of actually engaging. So that's Osius, by this stage, quite old, possibly 80, is, I think, his friendship with Marcellus, a moment where they both kind of get carried away, I think. And it's a very interesting moment to look at. It's very interesting in terms of documenting what happened at Nicaea, thinking about what was Nicaea, how was it constructed, what does it mean to invite representative bishops, all those kinds of things. But that was all it achieved, really. What it mainly achieved was people thinking, this is not the answer. And I think it achieved Athanasius thinking, actually, we've got to go back to Nicaea and defend the wording of the Nicene Creed. Because, yeah. Okay, so that's all I'll say about that. So the fourth phase is the blasphemy of Sirmium. Just to note quickly then, and you probably all know about this. Now, the phrase the blasphemy of Sirmium, of course, comes from Hilary of Poitiers. And since I'm interested in human politics, I think the relationship between Athanasius and Hilary is quite amusing. I'm also interested in the relationship between Athanasius and Basil of Caesarea. All three people I really admire, but it's always interesting to watch people you admire not getting on together. So Athanasius and Hilary needle each other in their writings in the late 350s. And particularly Hilary is quite harsh towards Osius in this blasphemy of Sirmium and talking about the idiocies of Osius. It's really just very, very unfair. I'm sure I'm not the only person who's thought this. For somebody who's been locked up for a year with Arsacius and Valens, who must have been two of the least fun people to be locked up with. And if you believe Athanasius attacked and tortured and so on. And all Hilary can say is, what an idiot, how could he possibly have signed this creed? Whereas I think Athanasius makes a serious attempt to explain why somebody in his 90s, as presumably he is, might have signed up to this. And for Athanasius, the important thing is that his old friend Osius has not betrayed him. That he did say, all right, let's not talk about homoousios anymore, I've just had enough. But he didn't sign up to condemning Athanasius. So just to finish off the conclusion. So Osius leads us into this phase, which is going to turn into the Creed of 360, the let's not talk about it phrase, the why should theologians do theology anyway phase, the kind of bishops talk about God, goodness me, phase, the sort of phase of let's solve everything with something that looks like what we would call in English woolly liberalism, although in fact it's a Trojan horse, but that's another story. So just to the conclusion. Looking at the reception of Nicaea through the figure of Osius of Cordova lets us do three things. It shows us the unique contribution to the restoration of the Nicene Creed of a really interesting and I think often undervalued actor in the original story of the Council of Nicaea. It shows us something about the effect of age on theologians, not to mention bullying, that good people and even saints, as we now are calling Osius, do have a breaking point. You can break them if you really try. And it shows us once again, I think, and this is my final point, how much Athanasius valued friendship. And that even at a moment, the moment when he writes Historia Arianorum, his saddest work in many ways, when he talks about all the things that have gone wrong up till 357, when he writes it. So the 30 years after Nicaea, 32 years after Nicaea. He doesn't look primarily at his own woes. He looks at the sufferings of other people, and he tells the story of the sufferings of other people. The stories also of flawed people, of his flawed friends from earlier in the controversy. People like Eustathius, people like Marcellus, people like Osius. And all these people who were all flawed, it seems, in their own ways. Athanasius turns in his writings into heroic examples, standing out for both friendship and for truth in the face of a world that was really making both friendship and truth things that were really quite difficult to stand up for. Thank you.
Muchas gracias por la conferencia. Pasamos al turno de preguntas. Micrófono.
Thank you very much for your lecture. I am not sure I could understand all. This is my question. Coming back on the two narratives of Athanasius and Hilary. Beginning with the dedication creed, because it's interesting that for Athanasius it's an Arian creed, for Hilary it's an Orthodox creed, because he's aware that they compose the text against the modalist vision, and it explains the truth they do. Okay, but in the relation between those two narratives and Osius, my impression is we have two possible visions of the role of Osius, also in relation with the first conference we heard, considering the differences between sources about Osius. If we follow Athanasius' narrative, we have Osius sustaining Nicaea at the beginning, with a probable alliance with Eustathius and Marcellus and Alexander. Then we have Osius in Serdica, who is taking a position in the line of Nicaea, but quasi more modalist. The same Athanasius in the Tomus ad Antiochenos proposed the sufficiency of Nicaea to exclude Serdica, because in Serdica there is the expression one hypostasis for God. So Osius quasi more Nicene but modalist, and in Sirmium is signed, but because of the violence. No, if we follow the Hilary narrative, it's much more complicated to understand the coherence of Osius or maybe an Osius more political than theological figure, no? Because we begin at the same, with we sustain Nicea at the beginning, but then Serdica is going again the dedication creed and in a more modalist way. And then at the end, according to Hilary, is not signing Sirmium because of violence, is presenting the symbol of Sirmium, which for Hilary is the turning point. So what could you say about those two possible ways to interpret the life, the action of Osius according to those both narratives?
Yeah. Thank you.
I translate into Spanish the question and
Okay.
then you can answer. La pregunta, bueno, aparte de ser larga, añade otra interpretación, otra línea de interpretación a la cuestión sobre la actuación de Osio después de Nicea, que es la narración que hace Hilario de Poitiers, sobre hasta qué punto las interpretaciones son no sobre el modalismo, el posible modalismo de la fórmula de Nicea, hayan influido después en Sirmio y en otros concilios.
So I think you characterize those two positions beautifully. I agree with Athanasius, but that's not surprising. I agree with you that Hilary's position is not coherent. It partly depends if you think Osius really is in his 90s by 350. I don't know if you have an agreement on this. Do we think he was in his 90s by 357? I mean, how can you blame somebody in his 90s for doing this? I mean, one possibility is just to say it's a young man not understanding an older man, and I think that's something that often happens. That I'm convinced that Osius is not just a politician. He really does care about the theology. You could argue that his theology is confused. I mean, I'm not an expert on Osius. I'm sure some of you are. But I think he really cares about this, and he really cared about Nicaea. So I think, they broke him, is my thing. You can break people if you really try. And I think effectively they broke Osius, and Hilary had no sympathy. And I think he was wrong to have no sympathy, really. And I think Athanasius got his revenge by De Synodis, on the synods of Rimini and Seleucia, where he explained why Hilary's idea of synods just didn't work. That's my view. You have to go back to Nicaea is the only answer.